On September 3rd, 1783, Great Britain surrendered to America in the Revolutionary War, and as a result, America became its own sovereign country. After America gained independence, 7 key figures emerged to help lead the newfound democratic country: George Washington, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison went on to become presidents, while Jay became the first Chief Justice, Hamilton became the first Secretary of the Treasury, and Franklin was America's most senior diplomat. All 7 men were vital to the development of America as a country.
7 years later, in 1790, 9 out of the 13 states ratified the Constitution, which enabled it to become law. James Madison drafted the document, while George Washington, who was president at the time, led the Constitutional Convention. Other founding fathers were present at the convention, including Hamilton and Franklin. All of them were in support of the document, with Hamilton, Madison, and Jay writing a series of essays in support of it, entitled the Federalist Papers. While 5 states were quick to ratify the Constitution, others were not as certain, as it initially did not include the Bill of Rights. However, after the Bill of Rights was proposed, 4 more states ratified the document, which allowed it to become law.
Many components from the Bill of Rights, specifically the First Amendment, became the principles American citizens would live by. Additionally, the Founding Fathers deliberately included Article V in the Constitution, which allowed changes to be made as time goes on. As expected, additions were made to better improve the country. As different eras went on, America was put under different leadership, and various decisions were made that either benefited or hurt the country as a whole, which introduced a new question. If the Founding Fathers were alive, would they be happy with the state the country is in today? Although they may not agree with every decision due to the common outlooks of their time, they would support the democratic decisions the country has made throughout different time periods.
American imperialism refers as an economic, military, and cultural influence of the United States in other countries. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, industrialization made the U.S. businessmen seek new international markets that would help them make profit. The era of American imperialism is based on American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States is different from other countries because of the unique world missions the government possessed to spread liberty and democracy. It led the United States to believe they were responsible for social Darwinism, the ideology seeking to apply biological concepts of evolutionary theory to sociology and government politics, usually under the assumption of conflict between societal groups would lead to social progress. We're introducing the concepts of the industrial world, democracy, and Christianity to less developed savage societies. Along with social Darwinism, territorial expansion was a major factor in the late 19th to early 20th century. Poor countries were willing to give in to new systems and having a different lifestyle. At times, countries and civilizations were forced to give in to the American government due to their exclusive power. What would the Founding Fathers have to say about this time era? Growing up from Spain, revolutionary José Martí moved to the United States in 1881. He aimed for a revolution and independence from Spain, but also lobbied against the U.S. annexation of Cuba, which some American and Cuban politicians desired. However, the main issue was Cuban independence, which was a 10-week war fought in both the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean. Cuban, Philippine, and American forces obtained the surrender of the Santiago de Cuba and the Manila as a result of their battles, despite the performance of some Spanish and infantry units and defenses. In 1898, the Treaty of Paris, negotiated on terms favorable to the United States, it allowed temporary American control of Cuba and indefinite colonial authority over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines following their purchase from Spain. The defeat and collapse of the Spanish Empire was a profound shock to Spain's national psyche and provoked a movement of thoroughgoing philosophical and artistic revaluation of the Spanish society known as the Generation of '98. The victor gained several island possessions spanning the globe, which caused new debate over expansionism. Before the Spanish-American War, the United States was characterized by isolationism, an approach to foreign policy that asserts that a nation's interests are best served by keeping the affairs of other countries at a distance. Since the Spanish-American War, the United States has had a significant hand in various conflicts around the world and has entered many treaties and agreements. Although there was a push to win the war, the Founding Fathers would accept America's actions. They would agree since America is democratically involving themselves with the world. Despite Cuba resisting to negotiate, America continued to control Hispanic countries to make sure conflicts would come to a halt.
After the events of World War II, America engaged in an arms race with Soviet Russia. Although there was no real war, this period of hostility between America and Russia is known as the Cold War. After World War II, America let the world know they possessed nuclear weapons with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As a result, many nations rushed to create their own nuclear weapons for their own protection, primarily Russia. This led to the impending fear of nuclear war between the two global superpowers. Although America was isolated from the rest of the world during its early years, the Founding Fathers would still likely have an opinion of decisions made during this time. The Red Scare was mass hysteria over the threat of communism infiltrating the U.S. government taking place in 1947. It led to McCarthyism, the practice of making unfair allegations or using unfair investigative techniques against suspected communists. If someone supported communism at any point in their lives, they were subject to punishment under McCarthyism. This led to otherwise innocent people going under investigation, since many people temporarily turned to communism during the Great Depression, but since changed their minds. It also led to the execution of a New York couple, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, in 1953. There was strong evidence that Julius was involved with communists through coded letters that were decoded through Project Verona, a secret government program to decode suspicious Russian letters. However, Ethel was most likely innocent. The Founding Fathers would likely understand the Red Scare, since the country was created to have a democratic form of government. Consequently, they would also likely support Project Verona, but would not support McCarthyism, as it led to innocent people being convicted as Russian spies.
The Civil Rights Movement was a struggle for social justice during the 1950s and 1960s, for Black people to gain equal rights under the law of the United States. During Reconstruction, Black people took on leadership roles like never before. Society pushed forward on equality after the right to vote was given to all men. Previously, few African Americans had passed the near impossible literacy tests that were given to them by white men in order to gain their voting right. They held public office and sought legislative changes for equality and the right to vote. The 14th Amendment was passed in July 9th of 1868 and gave African Americans equal protection under the law. It addressed citizenship rights and equal protection of the laws and was proposed in response to issues related to former slaves following the American Civil War. The 15th Amendment followed in February 3rd, 1870. The 15th Amendment of the United States Constitution prohibits the federal and state governments from denying a citizen the right to vote based on that citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Even with the right to vote, African Americans were still constricted by segregation and Jim Crow laws during the late 19th century. Segregation was the enforced separation of different racial groups in a country, community, or establishment. Jim Crow laws refer to a series of racist laws and measures that discriminated against African Americans. They were not allowed to go to the same bathrooms as whites, nor the same schools as them.
What is your experience with the integration of African Americans into Boston public schools?
Well, when I was 8 years old, I lived in East Boston, and at that time they were busing the African Americans into the East Boston public schools. And at the end of the school day, when they were getting back on the buses, there used to be people that would be yelling and throwing things at the bus. And the teachers used to make the kids that walked, that lived in the neighborhood, stay behind until all the buses were gone and it was safe for us to go out. So we would have to stay an extra half an hour after school until all the buses were gone.
During the war-related boom in factories, Black people were not allowed to get any of the better-paying jobs. They were also discouraged from joining the military. On June 25th, in 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an executive order that opened national defense jobs and other government jobs to all Americans regardless of race.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This afternoon, following a series of threats and defiant statements, the presence of Alabama National Guardsmen was required on the University of Alabama to carry out the final and unequivocal order of the United States District Court of the Northern District of Alabama. That order called for the admission of two clearly qualified young Alabama residents who happened to have been born Negro. That they were admitted peacefully on the campus is due in good measure to the conduct of the students of the University of Alabama who met their responsibilities in a constructive way. I hope that every American, regardless of where he lives, will stop and examine his conscience about this and other related incidents. This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. Today we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free. And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. And it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and to vote in a free election.
In 1955, African Americans were still required by a Montgomery, Alabama city ordinance to sit in that back half of city buses and to give up their seats to white riders if the front half of the bus is full. The famous 42-year-old woman known as Rosa Parks became an activist in the civil rights movement when she refused to give up her seat for a white man on the bus. This action led to a boycott of the Montgomery bus system, where 40,000 African American bus riders boycotted the system on December 5th. This lasted for 381 days, where they had the Supreme Court declare segregated seating unconstitutional. The Montgomery bus boycott was a political and social protest campaign against the policy of racial segregation on the public transit system of Montgomery, Alabama. It was a seminal event in the civil rights movement.
In the end, the Founding Fathers lived in a much different time period than modern-day America. However, based on the decisions made during various time periods in American history, one can conclude that the Founding Fathers would be proud of America as a whole today.